Namaste. So last time I did a live stream about meditation, and it was very well received. We got like almost 200 views within the first couple of days. But how long can people just watch somebody sitting doing nothing without any explanation? And this is borne out by the comments that we got. We got quite a few comments. But it seems that many people are unable to bridge the gap between the theory of meditation, the philosophy of the Vedas and so on, and the actual practice. And the reason for that is the philosophy is spoken with words. And words are dualistic. I mean, you can't help it. Let's see, I have to turn this down a little bit. Words are dualistic, but the subject is non-dual. So this causes all kinds of confusion. Just like one viewer asked, are you following the Patanjali Yoga Sutras in your meditation technique? Well, I had to explain in a roundabout way that actually I have no technique. Because a technique is something separate from me. Just like the words and the practice are different. Also, the technique is different from the actual meditation. So I guess I better start by explaining what meditation actually is. And let me just tune into my chat here. So what is meditation? I think a lot of people have a wrong idea about meditation. And the wrong idea is that meditation is something that has a technique or a method, a way of doing it. And that means there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And oh boy, there we go down the slippery slope into right and wrong, good and bad. You know, your meditation is bad, my meditation is good, and so on. We don't want to go there. But what we want to do is look at meditation from the Ajata-vāda platform. Now, you know, on this channel, so many times I put up that chart. I'm not going to show it now because you've probably seen it 100 times. 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, sleeping, and Turiya. Then from that, there are 4 different philosophies: Dvaita-vāda, Vishishta-dvaita-vāda, Vivarta-vāda, and Ajata-vāda. Each one corresponding to the point of view of a different state of consciousness. So we're not going to talk about any of the dualistic states. That means any of the waking, dreaming, or sleeping states. Because in those states, there is consciousness. But we're going to talk about Turiya. In that state, there's consciousness of consciousness. And that's a whole different thing. Awareness of awareness. Consciousness of consciousness. Where consciousness itself becomes the object of awareness or consciousness. So, you know, you've all probably seen the diagram of a snake eating its own tail. It's called Ouroboros. And Ouroboros is a symbol for this state of consciousness. In other words, we're not anymore looking at the senses or the sense objects. But instead, we're looking at consciousness itself. And consciousness itself becomes the object of consciousness. It's pretty bizarre. But what we have in the state of actual meditation is not any kind of consciousness. It's not any kind of doing. It's not any kind of duality where there's something separate from oneself. Because consciousness is who we are. Consciousness is what we are. So when we look at consciousness from our state of consciousness, Turiya, that means we're on the Ajata platform. And what does that mean? Ajata-vāda is the view that the world does not exist as such, that only consciousness exists. The world is unborn. Only consciousness is born. The world is unreal. Only consciousness is real. And that, of course, brings up the idea that the senses and the sense objects are illusion. Maya literally means that which is not. So, from the point of view of Turiya, from the point of view of Ajata-vāda, then only consciousness is real. And the contents of consciousness are unreal. This is enlightenment. This is self-realization. Because why? What is consciousness anyway? Scientists and philosophers have gone round and round for centuries trying to grasp what is consciousness. And they haven't been successful. And the reason they haven't been successful is because they cannot admit that consciousness is the absolute. Consciousness is the fundamental thing. Consciousness is the root substance out of which everything else arises. Consciousness is God, Brahman. Now, Brahman is a different conception from the Western concept of God, and even from the Vedic concept of God in the lower states of consciousness, where God has a form, God has a name, God has activities, and all kinds of qualities. This is called Saguna Brahman. And this is Shakti. This is the goddess, the mother. She is the mother of the whole universe because consciousness is the root of the universe. So one has to come up and approach this gradually, step by step, through the lower stages of consciousness. Dvaita-vāda, Vishishta-dvaita-vāda, and Vivarta-vāda, especially Vivarta-vāda. Because in Vivarta-vāda, one meditates on nothingness, emptiness, not even space, but beyond space, to actual emptiness, where there's not even dimension, there's not even extension of space. It's just real nothing. And from that, just next door to that, is the highest state of Turiya. It's a quantum leap. It's a jump. You have to go from consciousness of something to consciousness of itself, consciousness of consciousness, or more properly, awareness of consciousness. Now, what happens in that jump? Well, you lose the idea of a separate self. In Brahman, there is no separate self. Everything is one. Now, the idea that it's all one is called monism, and it's not actually correct. Because within the oneness, there's also differences. Within Brahman, there's also Shiva Shakti, God and Goddess, duality. The duality is illusory, but it's a real illusion. Just like if you see water in the desert, it's an optical illusion, it's a mirage. But it's a real mirage. There's no water, but the appearance is real and is perceptible with the senses. So in the same way, the consciousness of duality, where objects appear, isn't real, but it's a real illusion. So that's from the point of view of Ajata, okay? And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about meditation. I'm talking about Ajata-vāda. I'm talking about Turiya consciousness, awareness of awareness, consciousness of consciousness. So this is not a state that you can jump into right away. You have to build up to it in stages. But once you can make that jump, you find that everything is one, but within that oneness is the appearance of duality. This is Ajata-vāda. This is the view that the world is unborn, that the world is illusory. And like I said, when you make this jump from duality to non-duality, from consciousness to awareness, Turiya, then the idea of a separate self disappears, or actually it is seen correctly as illusory, because it's duality. The experiential self, the existential self, empirical self, or whatever you want to call it, phenomenological self, the individual, is an illusion. Why is it an illusion? Because it has a beginning and an end. If individuality were permanent, then we could say it's real. But the only thing that's permanent is Brahman. Even Shiva and Shakti disappear at the end of the universe, and they're absorbed back into Brahman, which has no qualities, no activities, no dimension. This is really, really difficult to understand. Actually, it's impossible to understand, but you can experience it. Now I know you're going to say, how do I experience it? How you experience it is, you have to deserve it first. You have to perform the karma yoga and the bhakti yoga that purifies your body and mind and gives you the karmic bank account, so to speak, the karmic credits that you deserve the blessing of enlightenment. Because enlightenment is a blessing. Turiya is a blessing. It's not something we can do. It's something that's given. It's something that's bestowed or blessed upon us by the higher authorities, Shiva and Shakti. They want us to become enlightened. It delights them tremendously when we become qualified, and we deserve the blessing of enlightenment. But to receive that blessing, we have to simply wait. That's why meditation, real meditation, is doing nothing. Simply waiting, simply being, not doing, not even thinking, not even looking, but just closing the doors of perception and waiting. And this waiting assumes that one has qualified, I'll give an example from my own life. In 1984, on winter solstice, I was blessed with the first stage of enlightenment. It's called First Path, and it's very, very strong and dramatic. So, up until that time, for 25 years, I had been serving my Adi Guru. My Adi Guru was an enlightened person, and he was, although he was teaching externally bhakti and karma yoga, still he was an enlightened person, and he could see that I was ready for this. So he set me up in a way. And I won't go into all the details of how he did that, but he set me up to receive the blessing of enlightenment from the goddess. So, years later, even after he passed away from this world, by serving him, I accrued sufficient good karma to deserve the blessings of enlightenment. What are the symptoms leading up to this? Well, you start to see that the world is just a sham. It's an illusion. It's a mirage. It's a bunch of false promises. And you start to see that your relationships are all lies. And when you go to the root of that, you see that it's because your so-called self, your so-called identity, who you think you are, is actually just a projection, just a role that you play. A way that you manipulate this body and mind in relation to the world and other people to try to convince yourself and them that you're a real person, that you have a real identity. Even though, if you take a step back and look at it, how much our identity changes from being a baby, an infant, to a youngster, to a young rascal, to an adolescent, to a young adult, to a full adult, to a middle-aged, to a senior, to an old person, and finally death. So from birth to death, there are so many changes in who we are, who we think we are, what we think is important, what we want to do, and so on, that this cannot possibly be real. Because what is real is permanent. It doesn't change. So when we come to the point where we see that the only thing that doesn't change is consciousness, everything else changes. But this awareness that is aware of it all never changes, never begins nor ends. You might say, well, what about unconsciousness? Or what about deep sleep when you're not aware of anything? What about when you faint or when you're under anesthetic? Well, this is simply the senses closing down. And because we're looking outward toward the senses, when they close down, we're aware of nothing. We're still aware. But because the senses are gone, there's nothing to be aware of, or so we think. But when we transcend even this state to become aware of awareness, to become conscious of the fact that we are conscious, then everything changes. Because now we see that we are always conscious. We have always been conscious. We will always be conscious. And there's never a beginning or an end to it. And just that we become overwhelmed by ignorance, and we take this body as being ourself. We take this mind as being me. I. And I am different from everybody else. But actually, the consciousness in every being is the same. It's simply the universal flow of life energy going through the various chakras, these vortexes of energy at different frequencies. And because they have different frequencies, like radio waves, they have different functions. Some radio waves won't even penetrate a wall. Some will go through the whole earth, neutrinos. They're basically the same thing, electromagnetic energy, radiation. But because they have different frequencies, they have different functions. Same is true of life energy. So the preliminary steps of meditation mean to raise the life energy to higher and higher chakras. This is Kundalini. Kundalini means the life energy flowing through the chakras is refined and raised to higher and higher vibrations. So when this is complete, then we say that Kundalini rises. And she will rise all on her own. We don't have to push her. We don't have to pull her. We don't have to get her to do anything. It will just happen. This is my experience. When you are fully qualified, when you are fully ready, Kundalini will rise all by herself, without any trouble, without any suffering, without any fits or seizures or weird symptoms. That's all the result of trying to make her rise. See, but she can't be made to rise. She is far more powerful than we are. So when she finally arises, when the senses and the chakras are completely pure, when the mind is aligned with her views, and of course her views are Ajata-vāda and Turiya consciousness, then at that time we can perceive directly that we are nothing but consciousness. We are nothing but awareness, and that awareness has no beginning nor end. We have always been aware. We will always be aware, because this awareness is outside of time. So we can easily see from that point of view that our beingness, which is the precursor, the condition for awareness, is also like that. In fact, in that state, there's no difference between being and consciousness and bliss. Sat-Chit-Ananda. Sat means eternal existence, no beginning or end. Chit means consciousness or awareness. And Ananda means bliss, happiness. Sat-Chit-Ananda. But it's not the kind of happiness that you get, from getting something you want, let's say. That kind of happiness comes and goes. It may be very intense in the moment when we get what we want, but it never lasts. And you see, Sat, Chit, and Ananda in the material world are reversed and become Asat, Nischit, and Nirananda. In other words, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. These are the three factors or conditions of the material world as taught by the Buddha. That the material world, everything in it, everything about it is impermanent. It has a beginning and an end. And it's unsatisfactory. Even if we get what we think we want, there's always something wrong with it. And of course, the first thing wrong with it is that it's impermanent. And finally, whatever we get in this material world is not self. So this is completely backwards from the actual situation, which is Sat-Chit-Ananda, meaning that it is permanent, perfect consciousness and bliss, all in one. This is the only way that we can really be happy. There is no real happiness in the world, or any part of the world, or any aspect of it. There can only be happiness when one realizes, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. I am the root consciousness of everything. I am the pure energy of existence. Existence, consciousness, and bliss. No beginning and no end. So, see, this is completely separate from everything else that we experience. That's why it's said that there's a river. There's a river between us and nirvana or nibbana. We have to cross that river. And the boat by which we cross that river is the Dharma. Dharma, in one sense, means religious principles in its lower meaning. But in its higher meaning, it means simply recognizing the actual nature of things. The actual nature of the self. So, this is meditation. It's not a doing, it's a being. It means crossing that river between duality and non-duality and attaining the farther shore of non-dualism. So this is not something you do, this is something you are. So you have always been Brahman. You will always be Brahman. It's already done. It's not something that you have to do. You simply have to recognize it. And when you recognize it, and this is done by inference, by contemplating the words of the scriptures, especially the Upanishads and Vedanta, and also by meditation practice. Neti neti. This is not it. This is not it. This is not it. Neti neti. Until you finally come to iti iti. This is it. Then you'll know. You'll know. You don't need anybody to tell you. You don't need anybody to approve your enlightenment, to rubber stamp your passport. Ooh, this one's enlightened. Because no, organizations and teachers will not do that. They won't recognize your enlightenment because that would mean the end of their business. So avoid them. Go straight to the source. Go straight to the scriptures. Read the Buddha Sutras. Read Vedanta. Read the Vedas, the Upanishads. They explain everything. You don't need to join an organization. You don't need to, pay somebody to teach you. That's ridiculous. Don't do it. All the secrets are already there in the scriptures. All you have to do is learn how to read them. That is something you have to do on your own. But we've given all the tools. We've given, matrix learning, for example, or becoming genius. I've gone back to the original name, Becoming Genius. Look it up, or I'll put a link in the video description. This is how you can learn anything. And of course, the best thing you can learn is how to attain enlightenment. That's why we have so many videos, and they're all on different levels. So we recently went through and classified all the videos, every single video on the channel. Now the video description begins with this video or this series is classified as such and such. Dvaita-vāda, Vishishta-dvaita-vāda, Ajata-vāda, or Vivarta-vāda or Ajata-vāda. And then the particular chakra whose function that video is explaining. So in that way, you can go from the beginning to the end. That's why we have the video index, which is also linked in the description. And that's why we go through so many different topics, so that you can start at the level where you are and then proceed further. So, I'm going to take a look at the chat now and see what are the questions and what I might want to address there. No questions. Oh yeah, Catboy, I was going to explain, when you start out on this path, and especially once you start getting the realizations, you're going to see that everyone is asleep. You're going to see that basically everyone is crazy. Huh? They're taking abstractions like money, countries, governments, politics, religions, etc., 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 as real. But what are these things? They're only words. Somebody draws a line on a map and says, this is one country and over there is another country. Huh? What? You see, it's completely arbitrary. It's completely man-made distinction. It doesn't really exist in nature. Oh yeah, there are some natural boundaries like oceans and deserts and stuff like that. But still, human beings like to create things like corporations that exist only on paper. And then they run around as if they're real. It's a consensual hallucination, as Einstein described it. He says, mankind is in the grip of a consensual hallucination called society. We say this, our society, and this other society, and this religion and that religion, and so on. And then we make distinctions between people, and, we make distinctions between self and other. That's the fundamental distinction. And from that distinction, all others are coming. And they're all illusion. They're all Maya, that which is not. And you see this, you even begin to see this. You go out of agreement with the whole society. Your family, your religion, your country, your politicals, whatever. Because you see, these are all simply abstractions. They have no reality. And so, since everybody else is running around believing in the abstraction as if it's real, you go out of agreement with everybody. It's a very lonely thing in the beginning. You go, oh my God, how can I climb this mountain? Huh? There's no stairway, there's no rope, there's no nothing. It's just a sheer cliff. I have to go up this thing with no help whatsoever from anybody. Well, this is the first step, when you recognize your aloneness. And then you have to go on, take that in stride, and find that actually you're one with everything. So I think the chat's getting active. Let's see before it scrolls off the screen. Yeah, so X dreams to reality has got it right. See, what is it about an enlightened person that makes them different. They're outside of time, because from their point of view, nothing ever changes. So when they manifest a personality, a self, an ego, for the sake of the world, that is a complete construct. It's a complete fabrication. I mean, and so is everybody else's ego. The difference is that the enlightened person knows it and is doing it deliberately, using the process of becoming, paticca samuppada, as it was taught by the Buddha. And the same thing is taught in Vedas, just using different language. It's called tattva darshana, or Jñāna-yoga. These are different names for the same thing, which means creating things basically out of nothing that appear to exist, at least temporarily, in the world. So the whole universe is created like this, by Shakti. And then when a person becomes enlightened, they merge into this. And what's left is just a shell. But they know it's a shell. They know it's a construction. They know it's a fabrication, and they do it deliberately. So we string together moments of time in a certain sequence to convey a particular meaning. But the meaning is already existing, and simply by shifting your consciousness, you can see it directly. But all of our teachings, all of the different mantras, all the different scriptures are only for that. To convey this teaching, this reality that is beyond the material reality, conditioned consciousness that most people live in. And when we realize that unconditioned consciousness, that's when everything changes. Everything turns around. We see the real reality, which never changes, or we are the real reality, which never changes. And then there's this constructed reality, this fabricated or fake reality that is constantly changing. And so that's time. We can only constate time from the constant changes in the material energy. Since none of it is real, it's all an illusion. It's just a thought. Like Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi said, even death is just a thought. So why get all worked up about it? Why get all wound up and anxious? And, there's nothing but love, actually. So we express that love by teaching these timeless truths, this Dharma, the essence of Dharma, which is an experience, ultimately. So that's why, while I'm on this meditation retreat, I'm not teaching in the usual way from scriptures and all of that, because that's on the platform of duality. Even this is on the platform of duality. But because it's a negation of duality, it's closer to the truth. It's in the Vivartavada mood. And I'm trying to point at the Ajata-vāda, because it can't be described, it can only be experienced. Anything we can do with words is only to point at it, like pointing at the moon. I can't physically grab the moon and give it to you, but I can point at it and say, look, there's the moon. It's just coming up now. But, so these videos are to try to convey some of that truth. What's this? Yeah, Vedas are very hard to read. It's better to read the Upanishads. Upanishads then are the basis of Vedanta. So you read some of the better Vedanta commentaries, they make reference back to the Upanishads and the stories in the Upanishads. So it's good to read them for context. One time I wrote a commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, and what I did to make the commentary easy to follow, I included the context from the Upanishads. And it made it a lot easier to follow the logic. I don't know why the commentators don't do that. Well, yes, I do. They do it because they assume that you already know the Upanishads, which, of course, today, most people don't. So, what does he say here? Yeah, Vedas are very difficult. Upanishads are usually more like stories. You don't have to interpret them. You don't have to have deep background in Sanskrit and so on. So how are we doing here? Oh, we've been online almost an hour. That's enough. Unless you have any burning questions. Doesn't look like it. So now we'll end off, and we'll keep this posted on the channel so that everyone can access it in future. And hopefully, if you think of any questions, you can post them in the comments and I'll respond. Aum Tat Sat. Aum Shakti Aum.